Shalom. These two fancy professors, one from University of Chicago, one from Harvard, write a smear book on Israel, Mearsheimer and Walt. The book is called The Israeli Lobby in U.S. Foreign Policy. They're basically trying to stifle the people who advocate for Israel in the United States and say that America's support of Israel has been bad. It's a terrible book following on the heels of U.S. Former President Jimmy Carter's slam of Israel, and clearly there's a group in America that wants to not let people who understand the significance and importance and beauty of Israel have a voice. I have a critique here by Leslie Gelb in the New York Times, the book review last week, about how awful this Mearsheimer and Walt book is. First of all, they can't be ignored because one's a University of Chicago professor, the other's a Harvard professor, and because they're arguing that the Jewish lobby pushes policy in directions that jeopardize U.S. national security. So let me just go through Gelb's arguments, and then I'll read you some reviews about how awful this book is. Gelb says, this commentary could not be more serious, and I believe the authors are mostly wrong as well as dangerously misleading. Former President Jimmy Carter made similar points, if rather hotly and self-righteously, in his recent book. Mearsheimer and Walt, together with Carter and their phalanx of backers at universities and research institutes, have to be answered on the merits. He says no one familiar with the extent of scholarship on their lives have ever accused them of harboring anti-Semitic sentiments until this book. They asked for trouble by the way they made their arguments, their puzzlingly shoddy scholarship, by what they emphasize and de-emphasize, by what they leave out, and by writing on this sensitive topic without doing extensive interviews with the lobbyists and the lobby. Then Gelb goes on to say specifically, first of all, their publishing one-liners is not some kind of evidence, and it's not the stuff of good scholarship. They move from one story to another, premised on the lobby's domination of the U.S. policy, but they rarely back that premise up. There isn't any discussion about the $2 billion a year package for Egypt. The U.S. regards the $5 billion as insurance between Israel and Egypt against an Egyptian-Israeli war, and it's cheap at double the price. But instinctively and without being lobbied, Gelb says, American presidents don't want to gang up on Israel since virtually every other state does. While most countries hammer Israel for crackdowns on the Palestinians, they hardly ever criticize the Palestinians or other Arab terrorists and say little about misdeeds of Arab and Muslim dictators. Gelb continues, as for the American government, the record clearly shows that when Israel crosses certain important lines, Washington expresses its displeasure in public and even more in private. Mearsheimer and Walt don't even mention that. And something that Gelb leaves out too is the Israeli democracy often corrects any problem, like the Supreme Court recently ordering the moving of the barrier, which has been terrific in suspending and stopping suicide bombing, but the suits were brought that it was infringing on Muslim land. You'd never find anything like that in any Arab country. Then Gelb continues, more troublingly, they don't seriously review the fact of the two most critical issues to Israel and the lobby, arms sales to Arab states and the question of a Palestinian state, matters on which the American position has consistently run counter to the so-called Jewish lobby. So clearly the lobby doesn't work most of the time. Mearsheimer and Walt leave that out. But at a deeper level, one ignored by Mearsheimer and Walt, these problems would not disappear or seriously be lessened if Washington abandoned Israel. The main source of anti-American and anti-American terrorism is America's deep ties with highly unpopular regimes in countries like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Iraq. Gelb continues, similarly, Mearsheimer and Walt mostly dodge the question of how to fix it. They don't want to abandon Israel, they say, but they do want the U.S. to distance itself from Israeli policies. What does that mean? Talk to Hamas and Hezbollah, who are terrorists, committed to the destruction of Israel? What is there to talk about? 9. As for pressing Israel to turn over territories and accept Palestinian statehood now, who do you talk to? Hamas? Or the far less popular Fatah party? And what concessions do they want Israel to make besides the one they've already agreed to? In the Clinton days, Ehud Barak, the prime minister, gave up 98%. He was willing to 98% of the West Bank, and Arafat started an intifada war. What do they want Israel to do? I know they want him to go away. Historically, the prime effect of the relationship between Israel and the U.S. has been to provide Arab leaders and discontented Arabs with an excuse for not putting their own house in order. I doubt, he says, Mearsheimer and Walt believe that if Washington stiff-armed Israel, this would induce Arab leaders to address their real problems. And then he says, there's the issue of nuclear arms. Yes, Israel's nuclear ability leads to some hurdles. But they should know the driving force between Hussein's quest for arms had little to do with Israel's nuclear weapons than the threat he saw from Iran and the U.S. The same is true for Iran today. America's central strategic problem in the area, the reason to worry about future terrorists, nuclear proliferation, is that we need our corrupt, inept, unpopular Arab allies. That's the real problem, and Mearsheimer and Walt never deal with that. And so, on the whole, when you think about this book, it's completely shoddy. Their evidence is specious. They completely misanalyze the situation. It's ridiculous. And America's support for Israel is based on moral, ethical, political reasons. It's the only democracy in the whole area. It's helped the United States over and over and over when it fought Soviet arms through the Cold War period in Arab countries. Its technological advances are helping the whole world. And of course, these two people that seem now to be anti-Semitic based on this book certainly have to be called into question. Ignore all of that. Now, a few reviews. Tim Rutten from the LA Times. Anyone familiar with the tortured history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will have a hard time recognizing the history that these two rehearse. Every hoary old Israeli atrocity tale has trotted out, and the long story of Palestinian terrorism is rendered entirely as a reaction to Israeli oppression. The failure of every peace negotiation is attributed to Israeli viciousness under the shield of the American lobby. There's nothing here of Palestinian corruption, division, or duplicity, or even of this unhappy people's inability to provide a reliable secular partner. The authors contradict themselves. They write all kinds of, they say Al-Qaeda would hammer its swords into plowshares, and bin Laden would lay down their lamb if only the U.S. would come out from under Israeli thrall. I mean, that's ridiculous. Baloney, he says. David Remnick, New Yorker. Where many accounts identify bin Laden's primary grievances with the American support of the infidel authoritarian regimes in Islamic lands, Mearsheimer and Walt align his primary concern with theirs. They give you the sense that if Israel and America and Palestinians came to terms, bin Laden would return to the family construction business. It's a narrative that recounts every lurid report of Israeli cruelty as indisputable fact, but leaves out the rise of Fatah and Palestinian terrorism after '67, the Munich Olympics, the Black September, myriad cases of suicide bombings, and other spectaculars. Steve Huntley, Chicago Sun-Times. The two go to lengths to try and rebut any suggestion of anti-Semitism, but you can't read the Israeli lobby without realizing that whenever two interpretations exist for the same action by Israel or its supporters, Mearsheimer and Walt automatically default to the darker view. And on and on and on. It's a ridiculous book.